Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Frank Martinelli. I'm with the Center for Public Skills Training and the nonprofit Repositioning Initiative based in Milwaukee. I'll be your presenter today. Before we get started, I'd like to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's web event. First, the audio options. The opening screen you saw when you logged in provided information about the two audio options, listening through your computer or listening through your telephone. I'm going to assume that you've already made your choice. During the webinar, everyone's line will be muted. Your screen. Your screen is made up of two parts. The larger viewing window on the left allows you to see everything that I'll be sharing on my screen, and the smaller control panel on the right. Next, the Grab tab. The Grab tab is that small group of icons attached to your control panel. Clicking the arrow button on the Grab tab allows you to show and hide the control panel. Also, the webinar handouts. In the control panel, you'll find the webinar resource handouts. You can download them anytime during the webinar. I'll also be sending them by email to you after the webinar, along with the PowerPoint presentation I'm using and a few other resources that might be helpful. And then finally, how to send questions and comments. At any time during the webinar, you can send questions and comments by typing in the question box on the control panel. Right over on the right side of the screen, and then clicking send. We'll be pausing a few times during the webinar to take your questions and comments, but you can be submitting them really at any time. As we get started, I'd like to take just a moment to make brief mention of the Nonprofit Repositioning Initiative. Today's webinar is part of this initiative. The initiative had its beginning with a TED Talk I delivered about 2 years ago here in Milwaukee. Since then, I've been working to build out the Nonprofit Repositioning Initiative based on the message of the TED Talk. And you can see it on the slide, that we need to reposition the community-based nonprofit sector as a powerful collective force for social change at the underlying systems level. And advocacy is one of the powerful strategies or tools that can allow nonprofits to reposition themselves in that way. The initiative itself, the purpose is to provide resources and network building opportunities like this webinar to increase capacity of nonprofits to deepen their impact at the underlying systems level and provide more permanent solutions to community problems. And there are 4 strategies that are associated with this initiative. For groups that want to move their work in this direction, there are at least 4 ways. The first is to redesign programs and initiatives that you may currently offer in order to address the deeper root causes of problems that you're working on. The second, to increase advocacy and public policy work by nonprofits. Third, engage in ongoing nonpartisan voter registration and education efforts. And then 4, connect community-based nonprofits to mission-aligned issue campaigns that are usually already underway in our communities, and they're addressing critical issues. Today's webinar really focuses on strategy 2 and strategy 3. Here's the agenda. Pretty much what you saw when you registered for the webinar. The focus is really on engaging the board of directors in this important work, and these are some of the topics that we will try to get to. A word about the focus of the webinar. We're focusing on 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofits, especially nonprofits that are service providers that have not engaged in advocacy up to this point. At the same time, much of what we have to say about how to engage the board of directors will apply to other nonprofits as well. Also in this webinar, it's not about teaching the fundamentals of how to do effective advocacy. There are so many great resources and training opportunities that address these nuts and bolts. The links to some of the best are included in the resource bibliography that is one of the webinar handouts. Rather, the focus today is on how to encourage and challenge more board leaders to adopt advocacy as a powerful tool for delivering on the mission of their nonprofits. Historically, this has really been the big missing piece, getting boards to really buy in to this activity. Most of the webinar content has been selected to provide you with talking points and information that you can use with your boards to get them to move in the direction of advocacy if they're not already there. I think some of the content will also be helpful to deepen the future involvement of the board, even if they're currently engaged to some degree. So let's continue with a description or definition of advocacy. Let's get started with some basic definitions. Advocacy, any action that speaks in favor of, recommends, argues for a cause, supports or defends, or pleads on behalf of others. Lobbying, efforts to win the support of legislators or other public officials for a position on a piece of specific legislation that is important to the people that we serve. And then public policy refers to the broader system of laws and regulations, funding priorities that form the foundation for how government at every level operates, and then how it affects real people. Here's a graphic from an advocacy guide developed by the Michigan Nonprofit Association and the Council of Michigan Foundations, and it's one of the downloadable resources that you can get to. Even though the focus, when we talk about advocacy, frequently the focus is on legislative lobbying and voter engagement, but this graphic reminds us that advocacy can take a lot of different forms. And some of these other activities can be ways for nonprofits who are new to advocacy to test the waters a bit before they engage in things like legislative lobbying and voter registration. Here's another graphic developed by the Stand for Your Mission campaign, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. In this graphic, we see advocacy broken up into three forms, beginning over on the left. Broad advocacy, educating policymakers, the media, the public about critical issues and the work that our nonprofit is engaged in. And then in the middle, legislative lobbying, working for or against a piece of legislation or a ballot measure, or for that matter, a recall. And then election-related activities like voter registration, education, and getting people to the polls. The important point is this, that the law allows tax-exempt organizations to engage in all of these activities. The one thing we can't do is partisan political work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go further. So let's talk about just a little more about why nonprofits need to engage in advocacy. First of all, there are a lot of benefits, and you can see a number of the important ones listed here. First and foremost, advocacy is another powerful tool that allows us to advance our missions. A lot of us engage in provision of direct services. We do this to advance our mission. Advocacy is another powerful way to do that. Policymakers need the wisdom and knowledge and the expertise of people like nonprofit board members, nonprofit staff, the community leaders from the communities that we work in. We all have important knowledge and information that will make policymakers do a better job. And we also know that government impacts the funding and regulation of nonprofits. That's certainly a reason for advocacy. And then another, the act of engaging in advocacy builds the relationships and builds our power with influential policymakers and decision makers. So it sets the stage for increased influence by nonprofits in the future. And boards are absolutely key. Who advocates for our mission if we as board members don't? And too many boards have been, in a sense, sitting on the sidelines for too long. And we'll talk about some of the reasons that's probably been happening. One of the reasons we recruit board members onto our boards in the first place is because of the relationships and the context that they have, and because of their reputation in the community. Board members have more power and influence than they think, and it's really time for them to start using it. So one important message today is not that it's an either or. Either we do advocacy or we do direct service. It's really a both and. Advocacy joined to direct service is what really increases our mission impact. So the question is not one or the other, but really both. So not should we provide services or do advocacy, but rather how can advocacy increase our mission impact? How can engaging with policymakers and the broader public about the important work that we do enhance the other things that we do, including fundraising? And then for all of us, what is the right balance among services, advocacy, and other activities? So one size doesn't fit all. We all need to engage in advocacy, but what that looks like is a decision that gets made in the organization itself. So we've talked about how advocacy is essential to nonprofit mission impact and that it really can't happen without the involvement of board members themselves. So if we're going to move forward in this way, we need to really address some of the barriers, some of the obstacles to board involvement in advocacy. We need to ask ourselves what's been getting in the way, and is there anything that we can do to remove some of those barriers? For starters, I'd like to share the results of a recent survey of Milwaukee nonprofits conducted by Ashley Benson and Kyle Hagee. Ashley and Kyle are two political science grad students at Marquette University. So this survey reflects nonprofits in Milwaukee. My strong hunch is that we'd see very similar results anywhere in the United States. The survey sheds some important light on why boards, and for that matter, executive directors, avoid advocacy in its various forms. In their survey, Ashley and Kyle asked respondents if their nonprofits were participating in voter registration. This slide summarizes the results. So you can see 77% of respondents who gave an answer indicated that they are not participating in voter registration efforts. Then they asked those who responded no for their reasons, and you can see some of the typical answers on this slide. We don't see it as part of our mission. We don't have the capacity. Our constituents are ineligible to vote, so why even bother? We haven't done it in the past. Other organizations do it. Our nonprofit doesn't have to do it, etc. And then they asked respondents if their nonprofits were participating in lobbying. And this slide summarizes the results. And again, 77% of respondents who gave an answer indicated that they're not participating in lobbying. And again, Kyle and Ashley asked those who responded no for their reasons. And again, you can see some of the typical responses. We're tax exempt nonprofit, we can't do it. It will jeopardize our exempt status. We need to stay neutral when raising dollars. We don't care. And then the other one over on the left, varying political opinions of our board. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. When you add Ashley's and Kyle's survey results to some of the other research that's available and also anecdotal evidence, we can really summarize the big barriers to board involvement in this way. Let's take a look at each one and how we might respond. Let's begin over on the left. We've already alluded to this. One of the big barriers is the continuing belief by board members and by executive directors, some of whom have been in that position for quite a while, the belief that the law doesn't allow exempt organizations to engage in advocacy, and if we do it, we might lose our exempt status. And really, the point of this webinar is to provide good information to address that concern. The fact is that advocacy is allowable and that you won't, as long as you carry out the advocacy according to the guidelines, which are pretty broad, that you're not going to lose the exempt status, that is not a risk. And we'll be talking more about that in the webinar. The middle one, probably the biggest and the hardest to address in some ways, the fear on the part of the board and also on the part of the executive director frequently that there will be a donor or funder or board backlash because they're convinced that issue advocacy isn't allowable. That's a little bit easier to deal with. The other reason there may very well be backlash is that sometimes, inadvertently, we've brought people onto our board or we've developed relationships with donors whose issue positions conflict with the advocacy issue positions that our nonprofit might take. So in a sense, the way we've built our boards of directors sometimes inadvertently produces internal resistance. And the response, you can see it summarized there. If donors and funders and board members are of the opinion that exempt organizations can't do advocacy, then we need to set them straight and just remind them, educate them to the fact that advocacy is another powerful tool to advance the mission that probably attracted them to us in the first place. And then if we discover that there are interest conflicts, conflicts of interest around public issue positions, first of all, we need to surface that conflict. If we have a conflict of interest policy already in place, let's make sure that we utilize it. And if we don't, then it's something that we really need to address. And I think that in the future, we need to really expand the scope of the due diligence that we do when we're recruiting board members. We want people that can write checks and open doors to funding support, and we want people that will advocate for our issue positions. And I'm convinced that we can have our cake and eat it too. We just have to recruit and vet board members, prospective board members, with this in mind. And then over on the right, another common barrier, sometimes you hear it from the executive director, sometimes from board members themselves, but the belief that advocacy is mission drift. And certainly for all the right reasons, one of the things that has been drilled into our heads in the nonprofit sector is that we shouldn't drift from our mission. And of course, we shouldn't. But I think the point that has to be made here is that if we're advocating to advance our mission, that's not mission drift. It's in line with what we need to be doing. Again, it's something that needs to be a discussion point if that appears to be one of the things that's keeping your board back. Well, let's pause for a second. As I mentioned before, you can type questions or comments into the question box over on the right and just click send. On this slide down at the bottom, you can also see a URL and also a toll-free number to the Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy Project, and it's great. There really is someone that will answer questions free of charge, and I know a number of people that have attended these webinars have utilized this toll-free number. So even if you don't have a question right now, in the future, this is just an incredibly great resource for all of us. So I'm not seeing any questions yet. If anything comes to you, just type it in anywhere along the way, and we'll be stopping for another one of these question pauses in just a bit. So we'll continue. What the law actually allows exempt organizations to do. I want to get into a quick summary of what the law does allow us to do in the way of advocacy, and there are links to much more detailed information in some of the webinar handouts. So let's start with what's definitely okay. And the information on the next few slides is from the Stand for Your Mission campaign. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but it's a campaign that was launched by BoardSource, the national governance training and development organization. So you can see the definitely okays, educating the public and decision makers about our work, as long as it's in a nonpartisan way, sharing information about how public dollars positively impact the work that we do and by extension, the community that we serve, and then communicating how broader issues impact our mission and the people that we serve. So these are all things that it's a green light, totally. This next slide, okay, but check the fine print. Here are a number of other things that are okay, but there is some guidance that needs to be complied with. So voter education, registration, and candidate forums, again, there can't be any kind of a partisan tinge to it. Naming legislators who support or oppose a specific piece of legislation, but we have to name all of them. We can't just name the one that we like or dislike. Limited lobbying on behalf of the organization itself, and then lobbying and campaigning as private citizens. So if I'm contacting my alderperson or my state legislator as a private citizen, I can certainly be talking about an issue that happens to be one of concern to a nonprofit that I'm involved in, but I'm making the contact as a private citizen. And then here's what's prohibited. And please notice that compared to the other two lists, this is a pretty short list. So organizational support or opposition of a candidate or a set of candidates, and then spending federal grant funds on lobbying. If we're a recipient of federal dollars, federal grant funds, we can't use those funds to support our lobbying efforts. And let me also add at this point that one of the things that adds confusion in this whole area is conflating or confusing the word political and the word partisan. Sometimes we hear people or we ourselves use those words interchangeably. They're two different things. We exist in a democracy with the freedom to engage in work to address the issues facing our communities. So it's a political process, small p, and it's okay to engage in this political democratic process. We just can't be partisan, so we can't tell people who to vote for and who not to vote for. I want to talk just very briefly about the H election. Now, at the beginning of this webinar, I mentioned that we wouldn't be covering the nuts and bolts, the technical and detailed aspects of effective advocacy. And I don't want to start now. But I did want to mention a provision in the regulations that now makes it much easier for boards to ultimately decide to engage in advocacy, including legislative lobbying. It's called the 501H election, and it goes something like this. So by default, 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofits are subject to an IRS provision that, quote, no substantial part of their activities may be carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation, end of quote. This test, called the substantial part test, has always been and continues to be subjective and not precisely defined by the IRS. And so this has made it difficult for organizations engaging in policy advocacy to determine whether or not they're in compliance with the law and with the regulation. Now, under the 501H election, this uncertainty is replaced with an objective expenditure test based only on the annual financial expenditure with no other limits on actual extent of the lobbying activities. An organization can take the 501H election by filling out a very simple one-page form and sending it to the IRS, and it remains in effect until it's revoked by the organization, and it can be revoked really at any time. And while we're on the subject of record keeping, I want to remind all of us that nonprofits, let's face it, we're used to an awful lot of record keeping already. Federal and state and donor, grant, foundation. So complying with the 501H election record keeping is not going to be entirely new for many of us. Okay, let's talk a little more about the roles that board members themselves can play. First, providing access and opening doors. After all, that's one of the reasons why we've recruited them in the first place. So they can help us get phone calls returned from decision makers. They can help us get meetings with those decision makers and legislators and policymakers. They can speak in support of legislation or policy changes. We've already talked a little bit about that. They can use their networks, their relationships to help us build alliances and coalitions in support of our advocacy work. They can encourage their friends and co-workers and neighbors to attend town hall or other meetings that are part of the process of educating decision makers and the broader public. And then in general, they can act as powerful messengers in the legislative and the public arenas. Once again, remember, we've recruited them to be on the board in the first place because they have connections, they have networks, they have relationships. And we tap those connections all the time when we're raising money. We can begin to tap these very same connections, networks, and relationships for the purpose of advocacy as well. So how do we begin to build a board buy-in? Here's where the Stand for Your Mission campaign can really help. This initiative, I've mentioned it earlier, was launched a couple of years ago by the national organization BoardSource, arguably the most well-respected and important resource for nonprofit boards in America. There's more information about the campaign and its resources in the webinar handouts, but I wanted to single out one resource in particular. They've created a discussion guide for boards, and it's just incredibly good. It's really excellent. And I might mention that they've also created a companion guide for foundation boards. And so it's, again, the downloadable discussion guide. The guide includes a process for leading internal conversations about advocacy and its importance for a board of directors. Let's just take a look at the outline of the process. Well, here it is. These are some of the things that the board is engaged in through the process that the Stand for Your Mission campaign has put together. And the intent is not just to hold an interesting discussion or theoretical conversation about advocacy and public policy. The guide is really designed to help us convince our boards that, in fact, we have the ability to do this kind of work, that we are not going to lose our exempt status, and that it's another way of increasing the impact of our mission. So it's really about starting a board conversation that helps the board address those barriers and come to a decision to actually engage in advocacy in the future. Okay. So what are some of the other ways to start the conversation? I've started to talk with groups about entry points. And entry points, I define them as moments or stages in nonprofit organizational life when there's often more openness to changes in direction and increased focus on systems change. And these moments of increased readiness to change can really provide opportunities to talk about advocacy and public policy work. And here's why I think it's really important to be able to frame these discussion starters as entry points. If you walk up to most nonprofit executive directors and board leaders and you tell them that, okay, here's another big thing that you have to do in addition to everything else that is already on your plate, that usually stops the conversation dead in its tracks. And so if we propose that the conversation about advocacy doesn't have to be a brand new big thing on its own, that it can actually be part of some of the things that nonprofits already do, it can be a much easier sell. So let's look at a few of these so-called entry points. Chief among these entry points is strategic planning, and this critical process can lead to an array of direction-changing decisions about things like mission and vision, our programs, advocacy, community engagement, and much more. And strategic planning is one of those key activities that nonprofits engage in as a matter of course. So this is something that most nonprofits are already doing. So it's just a great entry point. Some of the other entry points listed here can be part of the strategic planning process itself or as standalone activities. And again, these can all be opportunities to talk about advocacy and its vital connection to our missions. So while we're a long ways from advocacy really becoming the norm rather than the exception in the nonprofit sector, there are now many inspiring stories of service providers, nonprofits that have always historically provided just direct services that have now decided to incorporate advocacy into their work. And so I'd like us to take a quick look at a few, and there's more information available if you want to learn more. I'm going to be emailing you some great case studies of a few of these examples. So I want to start with the YWCA. Specifically, the two YWCAs that I'm familiar with here in Wisconsin, the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin, and also the YWCA Madison. Both of these Wisconsin-based YWCAs have formal advocacy or policy platforms that guide their advocacy and public policy work. And some of this work is done in collaboration with YWCA USA, the national office, and some of the advocacy is done more locally. In addition, these policy positions are an important part of board recruitment and vetting. So prospective board members learn, even before they come onto the board of one of these YWCAs, that one of their responsibilities as board members is to be active in the public policy work. So there are no surprises. The policy platform for the YWCA Madison is really one of the best I've come across, and it is one of the webinar handouts that you can download. A second example is another Wisconsin-based organization, the Urban Economic Development Association, also known as UWEDA. And UWEDA is a great example of an organization that came to a decision about advocacy in their recent strategic planning process. So one of those entry points that we talked about just a moment ago. Advocacy is now embedded in a number of important governing documents, starting with UWEDA's strategic plan, and some of the other documents are listed here on the screen. UWEDA is a membership organization, and so there's hope that there will be an effort to expand the advocacy and public policy work of their members as well. So a critical mass of nonprofits organized to do advocacy around a shared issue platform. That's pretty exciting stuff. Here are a few other examples. Their strategic plan with references to advocacy circled in red. And let me say again that you're going to be getting this PowerPoint file after the webinar, so you can revisit what we're looking at right now. And then here's their advocacy outline, including potential advocacy actions and activities that are circled in blue. Okay, another example is SparkPoint Contra Costa. It's a nonprofit based in California with over 20 service locations, mostly in the Bay Area. And SparkPoint, just in terms of mission, provides one-stop community access to a range of financial empowerment services that are focused on three areas: improving credit, increasing income, and building savings and assets. And here's what they hoped to get out of what they refer to as their deeper dive into advocacy. And it's an ongoing effort, and the initial results are very impressive. So you can see a few of the learning objectives, if you will. They're looking at advocacy engagement as a way to increase their awareness about root causes of poverty, to continue to assess their ability to integrate advocacy into service provision. And then the second to the last bullet point, I think, is really exciting. They see this deeper dive into advocacy as a way to build a group of what they refer to as social change champions among their board, staff, clients, and other community leaders that they work with. And with respect to SparkPoint, you can follow the links that are on this slide when you get the PowerPoint file. There's more information about their advocacy efforts. Again, a very, very exciting example of a traditionally service-providing nonprofit beginning to engage in advocacy. It's just really exciting. So the first three examples were tax-exempt organizations themselves. This last example is actually an example of an effort led by two Kansas City-based foundations to build the advocacy capacity in direct service organizations. And this is an example of a growing movement among foundations throughout the country to support and promote nonprofit advocacy and to engage in advocacy themselves. So even if in the past you have not really been able to get support for advocacy from the foundations that you have relationships with, it's probably time to revisit, to have that conversation again, because the times are changing. So The case studies that are available and that you will get in the materials that I'll email after we're done describe this important initiative in much more detail. They have, well, you'll get 2 files. One includes case studies based on year 1 of the effort, and the second file is case studies based on year 2. And they, in terms of the expenditure of foundation resources, it was used to build internal capacity, so training, educational opportunities. And again, those case studies will provide a lot more information from the 9 highlighted service providers. And I think one of the things that you will draw from an examination of these case studies is all of the different ways nonprofits can engage in advocacy, including legislative work and also voter registration. But there are so many other ways that nonprofits can test the waters. Okay, we're at another point for questions, and I noticed that there is at least one. So let's, let me just get it here. One question, are you seeing more examples of clauses supporting mission-based advocacy in paperwork for prospective board members? I'm going to say yes, probably not enough, but I think that that this is definitely an area where new organizations can break some important ground. It's still something that appears to be the exception. I think that there are more nonprofits that are beginning to talk about advocacy with current and prospective board members, but it continues to be exceptional. Any other questions? Any other comments at this point? Another question has to do with just asking if the foundation case studies that I just referenced, if they also include financial information, and they don't. But I'm thinking that it might be possible to visit the websites of the 2 foundations. Usually it's possible to find a listing of grants and even grant amounts. So I'm not sure about that, but I would suggest that you take a look on their website. Okay, let's move on. There will be one more question and comment break before we wrap. I'll also mention that if we're not able to get to all of the questions, I will follow up with answers, and I will send the answers, the questions and the answers to everyone that registered today. So there are compelling reasons for nonprofits to engage in advocacy and for our boards to lead in these efforts. We've tried to make those 2 important points. And with the 4 examples that we just looked at, we know that there are a growing number of examples of service provider nonprofits that have made this decision to move forward with advocacy and public policy work. So let's acknowledge all of this as really good news. But there's a continuing challenge, and here it is. Most nonprofits are simply not organized for effective advocacy and public policy work. We're organized mainly for the provision of direct services, and I want to make the point that we need to continue this important work of service provision. Once again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. So continue to provide the quality services to people in need and engage in advocacy. So how do we start organizing ourselves for effective advocacy? For nonprofits that want to move in this direction, really, how does the journey begin? For starters, more nonprofits need to pinpoint the deep root causes of the problems they seek to address. This knowledge of root causes, I've found this to be the case. This knowledge of root causes can be a strong motivator for nonprofit board and staff to take on advocacy in addition to service. The recognition that the services we provide are important, but frequently they address the symptoms. They don't really get to the deeper root causes, and to get to those deeper root causes, we need to engage in other forms of action, including advocacy. So speaking of root causes, here's a definition, and it's from a national organization, the Building Movement Project. You'll find links to their important work in the resource bibliography that is one of the downloadable resources. So here's their definition. I'll just read it. Underlying factors and forces that create community problems and make those problems likely to persist even though services may be in place to help individuals and families meet their immediate needs. So we're talking about getting down deeper so that we understand why, in spite of the best efforts of so many organizations over so many years, some problems just don't seem to go away. With the new knowledge of underlying root causes, we often learn that there are existing laws, regulations, or policies that hurt the people we serve, and then we take action through advocacy to change or eliminate these kinds of laws, regulations, and policies, or to work with others to enact better laws. And some more good news, there are a number of very accessible, user-friendly tools for uncovering root causes. Using these tools can be an important part of internal planning for advocacy, and we're planning to offer another webinar or two that focus specifically on these tools and how to use them. So I would just ask you to look for the details on that. But let's take a quick look at 3. Force field analysis, keep asking why, and the ICEBERG worksheet. So let's start with force field analysis. This tool has actually been around for a long time. It was created in the 1950s by someone named Kurt Lewin. And the basic concept is that around a problem or an issue, there exists a force field. And in that force field, sounds a little bit like Star Trek, but in that force field, there are forces that make the problem not go away. So there are forces that worsen the problem or deepen its impact. And then there are other forces at play that under the right conditions can promote or facilitate a solution. So using force field analysis is a way of mapping the force field around an issue or a problem that your nonprofit is addressing. And invariably, the result is a deeper understanding. That's really one of the exciting and engaging things about these tools, that people come to a deeper understanding of the problems and the issues that they care most about. So it can be a very, very empowering experience, and it's not something that is only for the staff of a nonprofit. Board leaders, community residents, other community leaders can engage in these activities with the same result. The second tool I'd like to touch on is entitled the Keep Asking Why worksheet, and you can see why. It's basically looking at a problem or an issue and asking ourselves, why does this exist and why doesn't it go away? So just repeatedly asking the question and going deeper and deeper and deeper. And again, like the force field analysis, this activity, very accessible and a way of deepening our understanding of why the problem won't go away. And this deepened understanding of why it won't go away leads to some new thinking about how we might address the problem or the issue in the future. And I'd like to just show you a real quick example. The high school dropout rate, especially in low-income communities. We ask ourselves why, and often the first answer is, well, youth make bad choices. The schools can't seem to keep students interested. In some cases, students are having to work or want to work rather than stay in school. We ask ourselves why. Disenfranchised communities and schools that are under-resourced compared to other school districts. Again, we ask why. A lack of equitable school funding in poor communities would certainly be one of the answers. And again, we ask why. And here's where we're really getting to the deeper underlying root causes. The poor lack political power. So there are a number of things that we can do to address some of the other whys that we arrived at earlier, but advocacy, community organizing, public policy work is what is going to build political power, community power in low-income and poor communities. And then the last tool I'd like to just touch on very lightly is the ICEBERG worksheet. And I think what's really great about this tool is that even if we have never heard of the ICEBERG worksheet, we've probably all heard and used others make comments like, well, you know, that's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's really in our vocabulary. We know that icebergs are big, and we also know that only a tiny part of the iceberg is viewable above the water, that most of the iceberg is below. So I think it's really an apt metaphor for a discussion of root causes. So what's happening? What can we see right now would be an example of the level of events or symptoms. And frequently, direct services address the symptoms. What is most observable and actually really painful to perceive. As we begin to go deeper below the surface, we ask, what are the patterns and trends that have been there over time that express themselves as these symptoms or events? We go even deeper. What has influenced or shaped these patterns and trends? And then at the deepest level, what are the assumptions, what are the beliefs, what are the values, sometimes referred to as mental models, that keep the system or keep the problem in place? So the community's view of poverty, why people are poor, why certain people act a certain way. These are all mental models, and frequently they're obsolete or very inaccurate. They don't really depict reality, but if we operate from them, that's going to influence how we act and how we perceive the actions of others. Let's take a look at another example or two. So poor health outcomes would be an example of symptoms, events things that we can see that are above the water. In the last couple of years, there has been a lot more important work to uncover what are referred to as the social determinants of health. So some of the other conditions in communities, poor housing, food insecurity, things of that nature that contribute to poor health outcomes. If we go deeper, and we don't do enough of this, we discover that there are determinants of the social determinants. So there are deep root causes of some of the other higher causes. The underlying root causes that frequently we begin talk about are things like systemic racism and sexism, extreme income and wealth inequality, and especially in a place like Milwaukee, a low-wage, no-wage economy. Well, no wonder there are social determinants of poor health and poor health outcomes. So we need to get to the deeper root causes so that we can address them and continue to address the higher level causes. And here's one more. In our community and throughout the country, there has been a lot of new discussion by new people talking about trauma and the need for trauma-informed care. And there's absolutely no argument against that. It's pretty clear that conditions in our communities traumatize human beings in large numbers. But again, we have to ask ourselves, what are the root causes of trauma? Again, we begin to talk about the economic and social and cultural determinants. And again, I would argue that we need to go even deeper. And at least in our community, there doesn't seem to be enough conversation yet about taking the steps to address those deeper root causes. So we are not going to remove trauma from our community without addressing systemic racism, extreme income and wealth inequality, and the low wage, no wage economy. I realize we're talking about very complicated matters here, but we're not addressing the deep root causes. And when we begin to focus at that level, the argument in favor of more advocacy, more public policy work, more community organizing and community engagement becomes very, very clear. I wanted to just add one other tool. This is actually based on a tool that the Building Movement Project has designed, and it's one of the tools that YWCA, one of the groups that we talked about earlier. Over on the left, you begin by listing the problem or problems that the mission and vision of the organization really focus on. And then from there, the middle column lists some of the root causes of those problems that we started with. And then, of course, we've got to go deeper. So over on the right, we list the factors that are the reasons those root causes in the middle don't go away or persist. So the deeper root causes of the initial list of root causes. Again, it's all about going deeper and deeper, and then using the knowledge and understanding that produces to begin thinking about other ways to advance our mission. So, building internal capacity to engage in advocacy. Let's imagine that a board that has never engaged in advocacy goes through some sort of an internal process, decides to make advocacy part of the work that they do. The next step is building the internal organizational capacity to do this work. And it's missing in most of our nonprofits because we've never done advocacy before. And here are some of the key elements. I want to touch lightly on them first and then talk in a little bit more detail about them. So we've talked about the board decision needing to be made, and clearly what it takes to get a board to decide to do advocacy is part of that internal capacity building process. And then if there is a way of using those entry points around strategic planning so that advocacy becomes embedded in our strategic plan. It's not an add-on, it's not a flag waving over on the far reaches of the organization. It's really become heart and soul of who we are. Like anything important, if the board is going to engage in advocacy, there needs to be a group that takes the lead. So establishing an advocacy work group. We also need to develop an issues and policy platform. What is it that we're going to advocate on? And then that gets turned into a more detailed plan of action. And frequently, we have opportunities to do that kind of thing with other organizations. So I'm not advocating that every nonprofit in town develops its own proprietary issue and policy platform. Frequently, there are opportunities to develop a shared issue platform, and that's very exciting. And then lastly, building a pressure-resistant revenue base to support issue advocacy. We've all heard that expression, he that pays the piper calls the tune. So if we're heavily reliant on donors and funders and foundations that are resistant to advocacy, we're not going to be surprised that our nonprofit has not engaged in it historically. So how do we diversify our revenue base so that there's support for direct services and support for advocacy? Let's take a closer look at a few. So we've already talked previously about looking at strategic planning as an entry point, figuring out a way of embedding advocacy in the bedrock, the foundation of our work, rather than some sort of an add-on. So we would expect in the future to see the theme of advocacy reflected in our mission and vision, in the goals, in the action objectives that make up the strategic plan. And then in implementing the action plans, we would also expect that the initiatives, and some of them are going to be new, some of them are going to be reflective of an advocacy or public policy orientation, that the logic models, the outcomes that we define need to be in place. So it's as important to have advocacy outcomes as it is to have service delivery outcomes. And then, well, really the theme of this webinar, we need to build a board that is on board with respect to advocacy. It has to be an expectation for all of the board, not just the one or two board members that are really excited about advocacy or the members of the advocacy committee. We really need to build throughout the board that kind of commitment. It's also going to change how we go about recruitment. We're still going to be looking for people that can write checks and open doors to donations and foundation support. And, not a but, and we also need to find people that understand that being on a board today means that I'm going to be supporting mission-driven advocacy. And then we need to hold up our end of the bargain, so to speak. We need to provide the training and support for board members. Just a few more. We also need other internal structures to support advocacy. I've already talked about an advocacy work group or committee. We need someone designated to move the work along. Some organizations already have a designated advocacy director as a staff position, either full-time or part-time, but somebody needs to be the point person for this. And I know that that leads to a conversation about where does the funding come from, but once again, the good news is that more foundations and more donors are beginning to see advocacy as worthy of their support. There needs to be an agreed upon process for selecting the advocacy issues that we work on. we need an established issue agenda, and in some cases, we need access to position papers on some of these key issues to educate ourselves and then also to begin to educate the decision makers. And sometimes these position papers already exist. In some instances, we may have to work to create them. And then tapping advocacy resources of other organizations and networks. I think that this is an important point. Sometimes we don't have to reinvent the wheel. In fact, most of the time we don't. We don't have to start from scratch. That there are organizations that have always been out there in our communities that focus primarily on advocacy and public policy work. They're looking for allies. They're looking for coalition partners so they can supply us with the position papers, with the evidence-based, field-tested policy positions and prescriptions that can be part of our advocacy effort. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those organizations before we wrap. I've already talked about the need to build a pressure-resistant funding base to support advocacy. Here's just a very quick, simple description of an advocacy committee in terms of the duties. You'll find another example in the resource packet that is one of the downloadable handouts. And maybe a little more about funding because it is an important concern. Building that pressure-resistant revenue base, knowing the laws governing foundation support of nonprofit advocacy. I think we alluded to this earlier. Not only are nonprofits themselves of the opinion that the law doesn't allow them to do advocacy, there are still too many foundations that don't understand the law. And that's why that Stand for Your Mission discussion guide that has been developed specifically for foundations might be a great resource for you to pass along. So I think in general, we're talking about continuing to diversify our funding base, and especially for advocacy, while we're waiting for more foundations to get with it, that we probably will need to look to individual contributions and earned income as a way to bolster our advocacy resource base. Yeah, I have mentioned this before. Let me talk about it a little more. I think it's probably an important thing to overemphasize as I am, because one of those internal barriers could be, well, we know that we need to do advocacy, but we just don't have the bench strength to do all of this other stuff, research the issues, develop an issues platform. We just don't know how to do that. And so if we're able to connect an interested nonprofit with some of the organizations that are actually organized to do this work, that I think is going to be one of the keys. And I've been talking about these organizations for a while. This next slide lists some of the important ones. We're Wisconsin-based, so a few of these are Milwaukee and Wisconsin-based organizations, but a number of them, Stand for Your Mission, the Building Movement Project, Boulder Advocacy, the National Council of Nonprofits, the League of Women Voters, Nonprofit Vote, the National Employment Law Project. These are all national organizations that are looking to support the advocacy of other nonprofits. Before we come to the last question pause, I just wanted to highlight a couple of upcoming events that might be of interest to you. March 13th, we're going to host a leadership briefing on the Nonprofit Repositioning Initiative, this effort to engage more nonprofits in systems change. It's going to be held here in Milwaukee, so you're probably very likely to get an announcement by email. In the late spring and fall, the actual dates haven't been determined, but in Milwaukee, in the spring and in the fall, in Madison, Wisconsin, we're taking the content of this webinar and expanding it to a half-day in-person workshop that will include some self-assessment activities and also include a panel of nonprofit leaders representing service providers that now do advocacy. We just know that sometimes peers can do a much better job of influencing others than a workshop presenter, if you will. So look for those dates. We're really excited about that. Another important development, Race to Lead, is a national initiative to close the nonprofit racial leadership gap. It's organized by the Building Movement Project. They came to Milwaukee in October. Almost 200 people showed up, so there's some real enthusiasm and excitement about the initiative. They're going to do a national resurvey on confronting the nonprofit racial leadership gap. It's something that we want to highlight because there is research, and we probably shouldn't be surprised, that nonprofit organizations with diverse staffs and with diverse boards are more likely to be engaged in advocacy and public policy work. So this effort to increase the diversity of leadership in nonprofits is certainly an important building block. And then this again is for Wisconsin organizations, although if you're out of Wisconsin, as I know some of you are, it's certainly open to everyone. On April 24th, there's an all-day workshop in Madison, Wisconsin, entitled Where Mission Meets Advocacy. It's hosted by the University of Wisconsin-Madison Center on Community and Nonprofit Studies. And you can see the URL there. Again, you'll get it in the files that you'll receive after this workshop. But a number of other training resources. I would encourage you to get your board leaders to some of these. All right, well, I'd like to end, and we are going to get one more question and comment pause in, but I'd like to end by revisiting the purpose of the Nonprofit Repositioning Initiative. Really, we have an opportunity to reimagine and reposition the nonprofit sector as a powerful force for change at the underlying systems level. And advocacy is one of the core strategies that can help nonprofits that want to move in this direction. So we really need to see advocacy in a new light. We need to begin to see it as a core nonprofit competency. It's not an add-on. It's as important as strategic planning, personnel management, fundraising and fund development, and some of the other core competencies. We need to begin looking at advocacy as not a choice that we make instead of doing direct services, but as a mission impact multiplier. It increases the impact of our services when we join service to advocacy. And then finally, the vision is really that in the future, led by the incredibly talented and energetic young generation of leaders, for advocacy and public policy work truly to become the norm and not the exception that it is right now. Okay, one more time. Any other questions or comments? Once again, you can see the URL and also the toll-free number for reaching the Alliance for Justice Boulder Advocacy Project with specific questions that you might have. Okay, there are a few others. Great questions. I don't have answers to all of them, but I will look to get them. One question, how long do nonprofits usually engage in advocacy campaigns, starting with building alliances and coalitions and then taking more ownership? You know, it's a hard thing to generalize around. There are some nonprofits that begin the journey usually in partnership with organizations that are already active in that space. And then as they begin to build more internal capacity, they begin to take on campaigns alone, perhaps in concert with other nonprofits, but they're leading campaigns. They're not just members of campaigns that are already existing. And then there's a question that I am not able to answer right now, a question regarding the advantage of setting up a 501c6, a trade organization, a lot of statewide nonprofit associations representing a particular profession or industry or trade. They have a lot more latitude over other 501c forms. The advantage, of course, of being a 501c3 is that you're able to attract tax-deductible contributions. 501c6s can't. And I hope that the information that we've provided suggests that we can have our cake and eat it too as a 501c3. We can continue to reap the benefit of exempt status, and we can engage in advocacy. And let's see, there are one or two more. The question is, do you recommend, generally speaking, do you recommend that organizations hire a dedicated resource to engage in advocacy, or is it a de facto responsibility of the organization's chief executive? Well, there are probably a lot of executive directors that wouldn't want to hear that in addition to everything else they're responsible for, now they're responsible for advocacy. Clearly, in smaller nonprofits, if the nonprofit is engaged in advocacy and if there isn't a dedicated staff position, the executive director is probably playing some kind of a role. But once again, this is the advantage of getting the board to really buy in. And if the buy-in is really solid and deep, it's going to express itself in a board advocacy committee. That advocacy committee of the board can certainly include non-board members, so a way of attracting other people in our community that have the knowledge and the skills. Sometimes, this is another path I might suggest. We're all familiar with Public Allies, the AmeriCorps program that that brings the resource of full-time staff to nonprofit organizations. I don't believe there is anything in the law or regulations that would prevent a public ally from serving as the advocacy coordinator of a nonprofit. So that might be another avenue to check out. Let's see, there is one more question. I know there are advocacy issues our small organization can work on, but the root causes are enormous ones that would seem to require tapping into a larger collective advocacy. Are you seeing areas where there is momentum building in solving root cause issues? I'm going to say that there are some glimmers of hope in this area. I'm, most familiar with Milwaukee and Wisconsin, so I'm not going to speak to the larger scene. This might be a question for the Alliance for Justice It might also be a question for the Building Movement Project. In fact, speaking of the Building Movement Project, I know that they have on-the-ground initiatives in Detroit and also in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a broader effort to encourage a critical mass of nonprofits that are local to begin to embed social change and advocacy into their work. I can find out more about that, and I will share that with those of you that have registered for the webinar. But I think you're absolutely right. These root causes are enormous ones, and we can wait forever for our elected leaders to address them. I think that the fact that some of these are so huge makes the case that as nonprofits, we really have to figure out how are we going to organize collectively to do advocacy around a shared issue agenda. Again, I'm speaking from the Wisconsin perspective. One of the things that makes it that much harder here in Wisconsin to engage in this kind of advocacy is we lack a statewide association. We're one of the few states, I'm sorry to say, we're one of the few states in the country that doesn't have a thriving statewide association of nonprofits. And in other states, especially some of our neighboring states, Illinois, Minnesota, and Michigan, the statewide association is an advocate for advocacy. That they do training, they do capacity building to encourage and support more advocacy on the part of their members. And some of us are hopeful that that we at some point will have a statewide association in Wisconsin, but right now we don't, and it just makes it that much harder. Okay, thanks for the questions. As I mentioned, I will follow up on the ones that I was not able to provide complete answers to. We've got about 10 minutes before, well, actually, pardon me, we're actually 5 minutes over. So give me a moment to make a few more comments and we'll draw the webinar to a close. This is a list of the downloadable resources. You can download them from the webinar site right now, if you haven't already. You'll be getting them as email attachments in about 20 minutes, in addition to a couple of other things. In terms of next steps, review the resources and share with others. Meet with your leadership, the executive director, the board chair. Schedule a board presentation. And I'm available to offer that kind of a presentation. In some cases, it could be as a webinar. Implement the Stand for Your Mission discussion process. You'll have that guide. And then complete a board barriers assessment. You'll remember that one of the slides earlier, and it's also in the resource packet that you will receive, there is a handout listing the 3 major barriers. You can use that as an assessment tool to see what's in the way for your nonprofit right now. And then finally, right after the webinar ends, you'll receive a link to an anonymous online survey. We're hoping to offer this webinar on a regular basis in the future, probably every 3 months, and your feedback is really important. And as I've mentioned, I'll also be sending you the webinar handouts in case you didn't download them. One more thing, check your spam folder. It's very likely that, at least for some of you, the follow-up email may end up there, and we really want your input. Well, thanks very much for participating or attending in the webinar today. You have the contact information. If you have any other questions, and if we can provide any advice by email or by phone, we're happy to do that. Best wishes and take care.